reveals that Canada is no longer reacting to pressure, but actively recalibrating the balance of power. And it is here that Washington may have made a serious miscalculation in its strategic assessment. This story did not begin with this week's speech, but with a series of quiet decisions taken many months earlier. To understand how this shift began, we need to return to early 2025, specifically February, when the dynamics first started to turn. At that point, President Trump announced a sweeping set of 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, covering everything from lumber and steel to agricultural products such as dairy. This was not a probing move to test negotiating positions, nor was it a tactical warning. It was a direct economic strike, designed to generate immediate pressure and force Ottawa to retreat. The message was blunt and unmistakable. Either Canada accepted Washington's terms, or it would face serious damage as its economy was squeezed by tariffs. To many observers at the time, Canada appeared to be pushed into a position with little room to maneuver. In practical terms, roughly 75% of Canada's exports still flow to the market south of the border. When a country's largest trading partner suddenly becomes its greatest source of risk, the instinctive response for many governments is to concede quickly and enter negotiations from a position of weakness. But it was precisely at this moment that the story began to veer in a direction few in Washington had anticipated. Less than a few weeks after those tariffs officially came into force, Mark Carney won the Liberal Party leadership race and assumed the office of Prime Minister in March 2025. He took over the country under circumstances that would likely have unsettled many other politicians from the very first days in power. The crisis offered no pause for adjustment. The pressure arrived immediately, relentless, unyielding, and without respite. By April, Trump escalated the confrontation further by extending tariffs to the automotive sector, adding an additional 25% on top of existing duties. This was soon followed by aluminum and steel, industries tied directly to the livelihoods of tens of thousands of Canadian workers and forming the economic backbone of many local communities. Week after week, tensions continued to rise, each new sector pulled into the vortex, accompanied by increasingly bleak headlines about the economic outlook. Throughout this period, Carney was subjected to the harshest possible test, not through rhetoric but through reality itself, to see whether he would buckle under mounting pressure or hold firm as the weight continued to build. Then came a response that caught almost everyone off guard. This was the moment when most observers expected Canada to concede, to deliver a largely symbolic reaction, enough to save face but carefully calibrated to avoid inflicting real harm on the United States. Carney chose none of those paths. Instead, he authorized a $30 billion retaliatory tariff package, precisely targeted at carefully selected American goods: orange juice from Florida, household appliances manufactured in key swing states, and alcohol from regions that play a pivotal role in congressional elections. These were not impulsive decisions. Each choice was calculated to generate maximum political pressure in precisely the places where Trump needed to sustain support. And Carney did not stop there. He appeared on national television and delivered a statement that immediately captured the attention of officials in Washington. There are no limits when it comes to defending Canada's interests. On its own, it might sound like a familiar political line, but coming from a former central bank governor, someone known for caution and for weighing every word, the message carried a very different weight. It signaled that Canada was prepared to push the confrontation as far as necessary, even if that meant accepting economic costs along the way. For the first time since the trade war began, U.S. officials were forced to ask themselves whether their pressure strategy would truly produce the swift capitulation they had once expected. That realization gradually began to take hold, reshaping calculations on both sides of the border in ways that would only become fully apparent months later. And it was precisely at this point that a pivotal move altered the entire trajectory of the confrontation. By August 2025, the trade standoff had reached its highest level of tension. Trump raised tariffs to 35% on goods falling outside the USMCA framework, effectively locking much of the Canadian economy out of the U.S. market. Domestic economic data began to reflect the very real strain. Factories cut jobs, supply chains fractured, and business confidence deteriorated rapidly. Looking at the economic indicators, many concluded that Canada was clearly losing this fight. And then Carney made a move that left almost everyone struggling to grasp what was actually happening. He decided to roll back most of Canada's retaliatory tariffs. Not all of them, but enough to signal that the strategy had shifted. In Washington, many believed they had finally forced him to retreat. In Ottawa, political opponents were quick to accuse him of surrender. Yet what was unfolding in reality was far more nuanced and carefully calculated than either side initially perceived. Carney suspended Canada's digital services tax, a long-standing flashpoint that had frustrated U.S. technology firms. At the same time, he tightened border controls in response to U.S. concerns over irregular migration and fentanyl smuggling. Defense spending was also increased to move Canada closer to its NATO commitments, an issue Trump had repeatedly emphasized for years. On the surface, all of these actions appeared to be concessions made under pressure, but the substance lay in the outcomes they produced. One by one, the justifications Washington had used to legitimize the trade war were stripped away. Suddenly, U.S. officials could no longer point to the digital tax, border issues, or defense spending as grounds for maintaining the tariffs. Step by step, Carney weakened his counterparts' arguments while reopening channels for dialogue. More importantly, he repositioned Canada as a rational actor, one actively seeking an exit rather than an open-ended confrontation. This was a textbook example of political statecraft, in which an opponent's pressure is deftly converted into strategic advantage. So where does the real center of this dispute lie? This is the detail that many external analyses tend to overlook, even though it is the key to understanding why the entire year-long sequence of tensions carries such significance. In July 2026, less than 7 months from now, the United States, Canada, and Mexico are required to conduct a joint review of the USMCA trade agreement. This is not a symbolic exercise or a routine box-ticking assessment. This review will determine the long-term future of the agreement, whether the USMCA is extended for another 16 years, sent back to the negotiating table, or even terminated altogether. If any one of the three countries fails to approve the outcome of the review, the agreement will automatically expire in 2036, unless a replacement framework is agreed upon in time. Trump has repeatedly signaled that he wants to make sweeping changes to the USMCA, particularly with respect to automotive rules of origin, provisions on forced labor, and allegations that Chinese firms are using Mexico and Canada as gateways to access the U.S. market. Seen through that lens, every development in 2025, from successive rounds of tariffs and retaliatory measures to the tense negotiations that followed, was not a series of disconnected events. In reality, it was a prolonged process of preparation, testing, and positioning ahead of the decisive USMCA review scheduled for July 2026. Trump's overarching strategy was to weaken Canada's position as much as possible, so that when the two sides finally sat down to negotiate, Carney would have little choice but to accept terms dictated by Washington. For much of 2025, that strategy appeared to be working. What Trump failed to account for, however, was that Carney was never trying to win the confrontations of 2025. His objective was to get through them, while quietly building leverage for the far more consequential contest in 2026, leverage that Canada has been steadily accumulating. While most attention remained fixed on tariff headlines and trade figures, another development was unfolding largely unnoticed. Canada began accelerating its trade diversification at a pace that drew the attention of international markets. New agreements with Europe, expanded engagement with ASEAN countries, and deeper integration with Pacific partners went well beyond diplomatic statements. They created genuine alternative markets for Canadian exports should relations with the United States continue to deteriorate. And this ultimately matters far more than the absolute size of any single market. In any negotiation, power does not lie in your current position, but in the alternatives you have available. When there is no other path to turn to, even the most unfavorable terms can be accepted simply to survive. But when viable alternatives still exist, even if they are smaller in scale, you retain the ability to say no to a bad deal. And Mark Carney spent all of 2025 quietly building precisely those alternatives. He also took another step, no less subtle. By rolling back most retaliatory tariffs and signaling flexibility on issues such as the digital services tax and border security, Carney shifted how Canada was perceived. From being seen as a weakened, cornered, and desperate country, Canada gradually came to be viewed as a reasonable and measured actor, while Washington increasingly appeared as the side escalating tensions in an unpredictable manner. This change in perception was especially significant as the process moved toward a multilateral review phase, where Mexico also holds a decisive vote. If Mexico comes to see Canada as a calm and reliable partner, and the United States as an unstable source of pressure, the entire balance of the 2026 negotiations changes. Carney was not merely managing a bilateral relationship with Washington, he was positioning Canada as a stabilizing pillar within a three-party agreement, thereby creating leverage not only over the United States, but over Mexico as well. Carney's most recent stance makes this clear. Fast forward to December 2025, and the broader picture begins to take shape. Despite a year of intense economic pressure, despite job losses, manufacturing disruptions, and political attacks from multiple directions, his core position has remained largely unchanged. In recent remarks, Carney has reaffirmed that Canada is prepared to return to the negotiating table, but only if discussions are conducted in good faith, without arbitrary tariff threats hanging over them. He put forward a proposal for full tariff elimination, effectively offering a reset. If Trump removes all tariffs, Canada will do the same. But he did not plead for that outcome. He did not speak in a tone of anxiety or supplication. He presented it as a rational option that would benefit both sides, while making it clear that Canada is fully capable of accepting the status quo if necessary. This was not the voice of a leader who had been forced into submission. It was the voice of a leader who has weathered the harshest phase of the storm and understands that the most consequential confrontation still lies ahead. That is precisely what gives Carney's position far greater strength than it may appear on the surface. Because